This is a special interview that a certain good friend of mine who can't be named because a certain organization doesn't like him. So I'm trying to use that organization to proclaim various things without, you know, getting their attention. So if you like to awkward speak, then you know that TGS probably conducted the interview. I may have to edit out the questions from such a person because I don't know if the audio might be scanned or something like that. But this is my most recent interview with them. I think this is my fourth interview. And this one contains new information that is not in my book, including the name of the source at Cannon Air Force Base who was the eyewitness of the moon landing fraud. I did not mention it in the book because his son was still alive. I also mentioned something else. There was another crime that this person did, I think worse than faking the moon landing. And they confessed to that as well. I did not put that in the book, but because their son is now deceased, I now mention it in interview. So here's the interview with that Ackwards TGS, and I may have to edit out his questions so that it passes muster on some certain platforms of various things. So let's see if this flies, the edited under the radar interview with you-know-who, and I may just have to cut only my answers back to back. So here it is. Take care. You could hire the general of the media department of the Pentagon and get great security and amateur results. Or you could hire the best filmmaker on the planet, which was Stanley Kubrick, who in 1968, what a coincidence, was shooting a film about going to the moon. So in his contract with Warner Brothers about the film Eyes Wide Shut, he insisted that it open on a particular day, and he refused to sign the contract unless it opened on that particular day. Well, that date was July 16th, 1999, the 30th anniversary of the alleged trip to the moon. Well, the first one was filmed there. We have information that the later missions were filmed in England in a dirigible hangar. However, the first one, because it was the most important one for people to be convinced that the missions were real, and after they accepted that, the photography got worse. But once people accepted it, they had to have good security for the first one. That's why they filmed it on U.S. territory at Cannon Air Force Base. So our person of interest, I did not put his name in the book. And if you go to Sabrel.com, S as in Sam, I-B as in boy, R-E-L, Sabrel.com, you'll see his son talking about the deathbed testimony that his father gave him. And I did not put his name in the book because his son was still alive himself, dying of cancer, and he didn't want to deal with the publicity. His name was Cyrus Eugene Akers, and he was the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico. Now, my father was in the Air Force, and I had never heard of Cannon Air Force Base. I had to look it up. If you go and see it, it's very small, which is great because you have fewer eyewitnesses. And of course, each branch of the military has basically its intelligence division. Well, guess where the intelligence division for the United States Air Force is located? Cannon Air Force Base. And I remember Bill Casey, a whistleblower at NASA, saying that the faking of the moon landing was supervised by the United States Air Force.
The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. One of these was Bill Casey, a former high-ranking NASA contractor with top security clearances. It was his job to coordinate the technical manuals of various departments, and as such, he was privy to a unique overview of the entire project.
I went to work for Rocketdyne, a division of North American Aviation Incorporated, where I was head of technical publications at the Propulsion Field Laboratory. And there I had secret clearance, AEC-Q clearance, and other clearances which allowed me to learn all about Apollo, Gemini, Mercury, other space programs. Apollo was a military project, and it was completely controlled by the United States Air Force as represented by General Sam Phillips. In fact, a lot of what went on at the Propulsion Field Laboratory, which was heavily guarded in a very secure area, much of what went on was withheld from the press.
So it was filmed at Cannon Air Force Base on June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1968, according to eyewitness Cyrus Eugene Akers. His son told me the deathbed confession of his father. He lived right across from Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico.
Hello, my name is Gene Gilmore. My birth given name is Eugene Reuben Akers. I don't want any money for what I'm doing because hopefully this video won't come out until after my death. So I have nothing to gain, nothing to profit by telling you what I'm going to tell you. My father, in 1968, was stationed at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. I made notes on my computer so that I wouldn't forget anything, because there's a lot of little things and stuff that I'd forget. So these notes were made a long time ago. The original recording that my father made on his deathbed was destroyed in a fire. So this is my deathbed confession, because now I'm dying of cancer. I've got cancer all over the place, and they don't know where it's coming from, and I don't know if they can stop it, but it don't look good. So I'm going to go ahead and make this video for Bart Seibel. He knows not to do anything with it until notification of my death. Like I said, in 1968, my father was stationed at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. We lived in Clovis, New Mexico. He was in the military police for over 20 years, and on his deathbed in 2002, we made a recording of what happened. Now, I already told you what happened to the recording. I was born in 1955, so in 1969, I was 14 years old. I vividly remember the Apollo 11 coming down, landing on the moon, and they're walking around and all that stuff. Anyway, I never questioned that until my dad told me what he told me on his deathbed. I've never known my dad to lie. To get caught lying was worse than whatever it was you did to begin with. I remember going to school with long sleeve shirts on to hide the purple welts. You did not lie in our house, that's for sure. Dad had a really bad attitude towards lying. Excuse me again. Okay. Anyway, this is the story that my dad told me on his deathbed. Project Slam Dunk was the name of this. President Johnson in 1968. Okay. In Cannon Air Force Base in 1968, he said by the time he got there, that there was already 2 large hangars that were connected. There was hundreds of dump trucks that came in and dumped sand and stone, and cement powder was powdered over the top of all that to make it look like a lunar landscape. They had men that fashioned it into a lunar landscape, he said. Okay, I've never known my dad to lie, so this all took me by surprise. You know, what's that all about? So anyway, he said that in front of the airplane hangars was pole framing with large canvas tents that was concealing the inside of the staging area. Inside the staging area on flatbed trucks was uncrated the lunar lander that was reassembled back inside the hangars. All of the walls were painted flat black and the ceilings as well. He was sworn to secrecy by the NSA, and they would put him in prison for breaking that oath. When Dad saw the moon landing on TV, he cried. He said he knew that what he had witnessed on TV was exactly what they recorded in that hangar. Dad was one of 3 guards that guarded the inside of the front entrance. There was a list of 15 people who could enter. No one else was allowed by order of President Johnson. And here is that list. And I gave it to Bart Seibel as well. And he checked out a lot of these names, and he says he can verify a lot of these people and what they do. And I come across a couple myself. Anyway, President Johnson, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, Werner von Braun, Robert Emenegger, Gene Kranz, James Webb, Joe Kerwin, Dr. Thomas Paine, Glenn Looney, Dr. Christopher Kraft, Dr. James Van Allen, General Trudeau, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Simon, and Grant Norrie. Now, the only 2 that I really have information on is Robert Emenegger. Apparently, he did a lot of video work and stuff for the Department of Defense. So the DoD did know him, okay? And the other one was Grant Norrie, Norray, I believe, was to the best of my dad's knowledge, was a like some FBI, CIA, NSA, who knows, something like that. Okay, President Johnson only showed up for the first day of filming. Filming lasted for 3 days, and the entire project was restored to original. In other words, the hangars were all taken apart, the sand was all removed, and so on and so forth. Okay. Dad said there was a lot of building going on at the base, so at the time, so sand and cement powder was never questioned. I can see how they could smuggle that all in within everything else that's going on. Dad told me all these things father to son. He also told me not to ever tell anyone what he had said, but he said on his deathbed that he had to tell somebody before he died because it was just too important not to tell. That's about all I can think of. My dad, he raised me by the book. I know he didn't lie to me. And as I started seeing more and more of what he was telling me was true, I realized my dad wasn't lying.
And so I already knew that the moon missions were fake from photographic evidence, logical evidence that they can't have 1,000 times greater space traveling capability in 1969 than they do today, where they can only go 1,000th the distance to the moon, even though we have 5 decades better technology, right? I mean, that's the only time in world history that technology was greater in the past than in the future, which is impossible, which means they didn't go. Then we have, of course, the classified footage of a 1-foot model of the Earth that they're pretending is floating in space. The lights come up, you see it's a model. And we have a 3rd track of audio of the CIA telling them how to fake the shot. Not for public distribution. Here is the most damning evidence right here. Here's the beginning of the clip. And what you'll hear is a 3rd track of audio of the CIA prompting the astronauts not to speak until 4 seconds have gone by. Now, what this footage is, and I have an unedited reel of like an hour to an hour and a half of virtually the same shot over and over again. They're claiming that this is a little blue Earth, halfway to the moon looking back, when in fact, this is a circular window of the spacecraft, outside of which is the Earth and low Earth orbit. Now, originally I said it's kind of part of the Earth out the window, which it does look like, but another cinematographer pointed out is what they did is they took a transparent photograph, like a slide or an X-ray that was color. They put it over the circular window. So it's a circular window and, of course, the circular Earth. And they've backlit it with Earthshine. Now, this is still the window. You can see the little, 2 to 3 inch indentation here, like on a ship, because it's a, pressurized bulletproof window, I presume. And first of all, if they're halfway to the moon, there would be a radio delay. So it would take 2 seconds for the radio signal to go out, 2 seconds for them to come back. They're actually in Earth orbit. This is, you'll see clear proof in a second here why they're still in Earth orbit, or proof that they are. They can't leave Earth orbit for a number of reasons. They don't have enough fuel, they don't have radiation protection, and so forth. And by them faking being halfway to the moon proves they didn't go to the moon. Otherwise, they wouldn't be faking it, right? And it also proves that the limit is Earth orbit, because they can't even leave Earth orbit. And what a surprise. 50 years later, they still cannot leave Earth orbit. Isn't that interesting? And yet people don't see that because of their emotional attachment and their pride, which blinds them from seeing the truth, which you're about to see, hopefully with an open mind. So what we have here, I'm about to play, NASA's going to talk, and then there's going to be exactly a 4-second delay. Remember, a pretend 2 seconds out, halfway to the moon, a pretend 2 seconds back. Then you're going to hear the CIA whisper in Neil Armstrong's private channel earpiece, which on this unedited version we hear. Then you're going to hear crystal clear, no radio EQ like, the astronauts in orbit or NASA with a little muffled walkie-talkie type sound. No, this person is where the tape's being recorded. It's crystal clear. He's prompting them to say talk. Take a look and a listen.
Oh, Apollo 11, Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
Okay, so according to NASA, there is nobody on this channel except Houston Control and the astronauts, right? This is an open, non-military, real flight to the moon, allegedly, right? But who's this third party prompting them, to speak? Let's take a listen again. Let's go back just a hair farther so you can hear NASA first.
Oh, Apollo 11, Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
You see that? They were waiting 4 seconds, then said talk. See, if he answered right away, it would give away the fact that he's really close to the Earth, because there's supposed to be a 2-second radio delay going out, a 2-second delay coming back. So the CIA told them, do not answer until you hear us say talk. That's on the tape. Here's the next shot. Here's where they admit that these TV pictures are not live. See, they claimed that all these transmissions coming from the moon were live. Okay, I'm a filmmaker. What we do is we pre-record things, we edit them, we make them look good, and then we play them back later. You're going to hear them discuss the very same thing because they thought these conversations would be edited out. Mind you, this is an unedited reel, an hour and a half long, and they only showed the public about 20 seconds of it. But we have all the private conversations, the outtakes of the mistakes, and the CIA telling them not to talk until 4 seconds go by to create a fake radio delay as if they're halfway to the moon, when in fact they're in Earth orbit. So here they are discussing the fact that this is not live, as we were led to believe, but actually edited, prearranged special effect.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we were seeing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that playback remark doesn't appear in any NASA footage, any DVD about the moon landings. It's only in this presentation here. Okay? Now, here is Neil Armstrong claiming this is the part that they did show to the world. Okay? This is the best take of it. You know, again, the camera is really away from the window. This is what you'll see in a minute, but these are the walls of the spacecraft in Earth orbit. And then here's the window of the spacecraft, outside of which is the Earth shine coming very brightly through, filling the whole window. And they put a little photograph of the Earth over here. And then they inserted a little crescent piece of black material to make it look like what's called the Terminator line, dividing night and day. So this is the footage that NASA claims, and Neil Armstrong is about to claim, that this is genuine footage of being halfway to the moon.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here.
Okay, so he's claiming that this is 130,000 miles out, right? Okay, that's what he's claiming. And then he's claiming here that the lens is right up against the window, which it would have to be. Okay, so if you're halfway to the moon and this is the Earth, you know, behind you, right, then you're going to have to have that lens right up against the glass.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
Okay, so Neil Armstrong just said they only had one view of the Earth. It's filled up with the TV camera, meaning the lens is right up against that glass to shoot that tiny Earth far away. That's what he's claiming, right? Well, let's just take a look at it again, okay? Here is the actual location of the camera, right? Remember, this is the very same shot that he said a moment ago was the Earth, you know, floating in space, right? Okay, we don't need the audio here. So here, okay, so this is the Earth floating in space. He just said this was the Earth floating in space. But this is the part they thought wasn't being recorded and never to be broadcast. This is the unedited reel. This is a work light inside of the spacecraft here. Either that or it's a giant UFO, right? Floating around the Earth, right? And now you're going to see them remove part of the crescent insert and the photograph in front of the window. That's Buzz Aldrin doing that right there. Faking it. They also say this is the way 10 did it. Apollo 10 faked it the same way. And then you're going to see the real location of the Earth and the window. And the window is actually, that's the window right there. So all the time, this was the window of the spacecraft. See how bright the Earth is? This is Earth shine. They're in Earth orbit, right? They just said that this shot, you know, was 130,000 miles away from the Earth, right? And yet, which in fact we can take a look at them side by side here. Here's the wide shot, right? And then here he is saying he's, you know, halfway to the moon or 130,000 miles out.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Okay, so that's supposed to be the Earth floating in space. Now let's take a look at it over here, right? And let's take a look at it. Okay, so to the right is 130,000 miles out, according to NASA and Neil Armstrong, right? That's the Earth over there on the right. But wait a minute, it's not. It's the window. They're using a 1 foot diameter circular photograph of the Earth, putting it on top of the circular window. And now here they are breaking down the shot, the photograph, in order to get ready for an interior showing the astronauts. You know what I mean? So there they are. There's proof right there that it's a fake shot. Here's even an outtake here when an astronaut's arm gets in front of the window. Look at this. Oh my goodness. So if that's really the Earth floating in space, that must be the arm of God going right in front of it. Oh my goodness. So this is the smoking gun. This is them faking being halfway to the moon. Okay? There they are getting ready, and there they open the iris, and there's Michael Collins, and there's the very bright Earth out the window. Want to look at that one more time? In fact, let's just make that big screen. Oh, it's really not the Earth floating in space. It's really a special effect with the circular window. Now, when I saw this, I said to myself, oh my gosh, they really didn't go to the moon, just like Bill Casey said. I called him up. I'm like, oh my gosh, they really didn't go to the moon. They really didn't go to the moon. I have them faking being halfway to the moon. right? They're only faking being halfway because they couldn't go halfway. Do you understand that? Which proves they didn't go to the moon. If they're faking being halfway to the moon, it's because they can't go halfway to the moon, which means they didn't go to the moon. And what a surprise. 50 years later, the same thing. They cannot leave Earth orbit 50 years later. Then we have shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart, which can't be duplicated in sunlight where shadows are parallel. You can prove the moon landing is fake from that one picture. And then lastly, we have a deathbed confession from Cyrus Eugene Akers, who was chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base. He stood beside President Johnson while they filmed the faking of the moon landing June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1968. He gave us a list of 15 people who President Johnson personally gave him and said these people are allowed in to observe. That list is published in my book, Moon Man, which is at Sabrel.com, on audio, which I read myself, Kindle, or print. And half these people I had heard of, like Braun, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, were there. The other half I did not hear of. A couple of people from the NSA, the CIA, and one science fiction consultant who's still alive today, Robert Emenegger, who was there, I guess, giving his advice on how realistic the sets look. Interesting note, the same Robert Emenegger goes around telling everybody UFOs are real. They're apparently just as real as the moon landings are. So why they want people to believe in UFOs is anybody's guess. And it gets even worse. His son passed away, and there was actually more to his deathbed confession that I did not publish in the book. First of all, I now disclose his name, Cyrus Eugene Akers. We've confirmed he was in the Air Force. You can go and see his tombstone, and it says so right there on his tombstone. He was in the Air Force. We have his military uniform and badges and so forth. The Air Force has tried to scrub the fact that he was ever in the Air Force. If you use a Freedom of Information Act, which was done, they have no record that he was in the Air Force, even though we have pictures of him in the Air Force. So once it got out that we had this information, they tried to, cover it up. Even at one point, Cannon Air Force Base boasted on their website the honor of President Johnson visiting their base in 1968. In fact, Robert Emenegger wrote in another book of his that he was at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 for, quote, classified reasons. So we have, more than one source that verifies that these events did take place. The part that we've never mentioned before, and not in the book because his son was still alive, is Cyrus Eugene Akers confessed to more than just the faking of the moon landing on his deathbed. The fact is, they cannot duplicate the moon landings. No nation on Earth can do it. There's never been a technical milestone in the history of mankind that couldn't be far surpassed, not even duplicated 50 years later. And then the whole idea that you could power the lunar module itself for 3 or 4 days in 250-degree heat with air conditioning nonstop and get it down to 72 degrees, I mean, that can't be done. In fact, astronaut Don Pettit of NASA didn't say that they lost the blueprints. He said that they intentionally destroyed them.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Now, that doesn't make sense. I mean, if you spend an equivalent of $200 billion developing a technology, you don't throw it all in the furnace when you're done with it, right? Maybe they should have done that with the atomic bomb, but they didn't. Just 10 years after the atomic bomb was first blown in 1945, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So if they could go to the moon on the first attempt with 1/1,000th the computing power of a cell phone, we would have been on Mars 10 years later. We'd be in another solar system by now, and there'd be bases all over the moon. No aerospace endeavor has ever gotten off the ground on the first attempt in the history of aviation. Not the Wright brothers kite plane, not the 747, which took 168 attempts to get the fuselage off the ground. Only the most complicated aerospace endeavor worked the first time. And NASA has never kept a schedule, ever. except the most complicated one of all time. They were ahead of schedule. They said in 2014 they're going to have a manned probe orbiting the moon in 2018, and it took them until 2023. So they were 4 years behind schedule with 5 decades better technology just to put a probe around the moon. If I were in charge of a real mission to the moon, I would put a camera on the side of the rocket and have a 24-hour channel of the moon getting closer, closer, and closer and closer, uninterrupted, all the way down, which they've never done. The interesting thing, a couple of points, is that they sent mannequins to orbit the moon. Now, I mean, why did they do that? That's pretty unusual, isn't it? According to the latest reports from NASA themselves, Kelly Smith said, and you can see all of these clips. My book is interactive. It has 16 video clips in it, and you can see all these for free at Sabrel.com. Go to the top left button. One of them is Kelly Smith from NASA, plainly stating, he says word for word, that the technology necessary for an astronaut to survive the trip of leaving Earth orbit to the moon, that technology has yet to be invented because of space radiation. So that's why there's mannequins on board Artemis.
My name is Kelly Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth, 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. For this flight, it's time to head home. We won't have astronauts inside.
And then they just published an article a few weeks ago that says in order to carry humans to the moon and the necessary fuel, water, and oxygen, they're going to have to make multiple fuel trips to Earth orbit in order to have enough fuel to go from Earth orbit to the moon. Then how did they do it in one rocket in 1969 when with newer technology, it takes multiple fuel trips? That's what von Braun originally said in his publications. He said these mathematical numbers are irrefutable. You'd have to build a space station first, ferry the necessary fuel up to the space station, and then, and only then, would you have enough fuel to land on the moon. And what a surprise when they, quote, return to the moon, that's the way they have to do it. But they never did that the first time, which is kind of interesting.
Here to reveal a plan for a trip around the moon is the chief of the guided missile development at the United States Army's Redstone Arsenal, Dr. Werner von Braun.
A voyage around the moon must be made in 2 phases. A rocket ship taking off from the Earth's surface will use almost all the fuel it can carry just to attain a speed great enough to balance the pull of gravity. Unpowered, it will then keep circling the Earth in an orbit outside of the atmosphere. This is the first phase. However, if we can refuel the ship in this orbit with fuel brought up by cargo rocket ships, it can set out on the second phase, the trip around the moon and back. To facilitate this refueling operation, we will establish an advanced base in the orbit, 1,000 miles above the Earth. This advanced base, or space station, will be headquarters for the final ascent to the moon.
So it seems a little odd that this is the state of the world that we live in. Yeah, it dawned on me that if mankind's greatest accomplishment is putting a man on the moon, which is what it would be if it were true, and the fact that it is complete forgery, and Nixon had the audacity to say putting a man on the moon when he knew they weren't there was the greatest event since creation, it really is a spiritual blasphemy. The faking of the moon landing, yes, it proves that our federal government is corrupt beyond measure. It also proves the state of mankind is being completely lost, that we can't tell the truth about what is our great accomplishment. It also proves that the people who run our government are juvenile. I mean, why didn't they just tell the truth? Hey, we set a goal, we can't do it. But the fact that they faked it is really an immature thing to do. Basically, the moon missions are fake. Therefore, somebody was in charge of the fake photography. You basically had two choices. You could hire the general of the media department of the Pentagon and get great security and amateur results. Or you could hire the best filmmaker on the planet, which was Stanley Kubrick, who in 1968, what a coincidence, was shooting a film about going to the moon. And you would have great results, and you'd have to worry about security later. They had to have as a priority the short-term benefit of realistic pictures. If you can't convince people through the photography, you're sunk. So they had to have chosen Kubrick. In fact, some people know, and there's a few documentaries about it, in the film The Shining, the little red rum boy has a hand-knit shirt in one scene that says Apollo 11. And I suspect that either Kubrick's death was faked or he had a great suspicion that his death was around the corner. Because not only are there pictures of him at NASA talking to the flight director, and yes, it is true, NASA gave him the first use of a lens that could photograph under low light, which he used for Barry Lyndon. It's also a fact that he stipulated in his contract that his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, open on a particular day. The most famous picture of a person allegedly on the moon is Buzz Aldrin standing with his arm bent. You know, there's so many clues that that is a fake picture right in front of your eyes, especially his arm being leisurely bent at 90 degrees when it's supposed to be pressurized, which it's not pressurized because there's wrinkles all in the suit. I mean, how many wrinkles are in a balloon? So it's like, you can see right there that it's not even pressurized, but you don't see it because your eyes are wide shut. You're predisposed to believing that it's real. So in his contract with Warner Brothers about the film Eyes Wide Shut, he insisted that it open on a particular day, and he refused to sign the contract unless it opened on that particular day. They said he's eccentric. What difference does it make? Let's give it to them. Well, that date was July 16th, 1999, the 30th anniversary of the alleged trip to the moon. So I think Kubrick was definitely involved. That's who I would have chosen. And I think they probably retired him, either faked his death or executed him, because a lot of the people I've been tracking since I started this investigation 30 years ago died at either the age 70, like he did, or at 69. I remember the day that he died, I signed on to the internet, and I think I had AOL at the time, which had news, and it said Kubrick dies at the age of 70. His wife says, quote, "There were no suspicious circumstances regarding his death," quote. And I'm thinking, that's a weird thing to say. That's like getting pulled over by the cops for speeding and saying, I had nothing to do with that bank robbery. You know, and it's like, well, why did she say that? Because there were suspicious circumstances regarding his death, and she wanted the killing to stop. So she wanted to cooperate, you know, with the entities that did it. You can go to Sabrel.com, get a cheap copy of Moon Man on, you know, Kindle, audio that I read, or print, and you'll hear the following or read the following. Cyrus Eugene Akers' son, whose name was Gene, who was my main source for this new information. Basically, he gave me this list that his father gave him from President Johnson about these 15 people. I called up a couple of the people on the list at the request of some friends of mine who wanted to get a reaction out of them. And maybe trace who they called. Well, they definitely called somebody, because I called up Krantz and told them that his name was on the list of people at Cannon Air Force Base. And 2 days later, Gene's house was broken into when he was out, and all the information and documentation about his father's participation in this fraud was confiscated. And then 2 days after that, two people who identified themselves as government employees said that if he ever spoke to me again, they would kill him and his family. Now, this was about 2 years ago. So this is very serious. The government is afraid that if the truth comes out about the moon landing fraud, it will be the finger out of the dike that will collapse the government. You know, whoever killed Kennedy, he's still dead. Whoever did 9/11, they're still dead. Unlike those lies, this was a positive lie. People waved their flag, they teared up, they got down on their knees and prayed. They gave him medals of honor. They put it in the encyclopedia, they put it on stamps, they put it on coins. For the public to find out that that was all a lie, even though this particular fraud probably killed the fewest number of people, I believe the exposure of this lie would cause the greatest outrage of the American public, more than 9/11, more than who shot JFK. And maybe it will come out. You know, I fear for the surviving astronauts because you know about snakes, they will eat their own children. And so the government didn't have a problem killing the crew that would have been the first crew to walk on the moon. This isn't my opinion. This is the opinion of the dead man's wife and the dead man's son, who's a 747 pilot, that the crew of Apollo 1 was murdered by the CIA. So they're killing their own people. So beware, surviving astronauts, because they're not going to let you get a conscience on your deathbed or become senile and ramble and say something wrong again. They're going to take care of business. And so I suggest that somebody else come forward. It's remarkable that we have this deathbed confession from Cyrus Eugene Akers. I already knew that it was fake. We had more than enough proof to prove it. And yet when you hear I was there, I stood beside President Johnson, it's just, you know, another chill goes down your spine when you know where it was filmed, when it was filmed, and a list of 15 people who were there at the time, some of whom are still alive right now. So what does all this mean? You know, it means that our government and our government is really no different than the governments of the world as far as corruption goes, other than we're the quote leader of the world governments. That means our world is run by a bunch of murderous criminals who are enslaving the people under their care. I mean, if you have to ask permission to open your business, permission to go shopping, permission to ride your bicycle, permission to go to the beach, permission to travel, then you're a slave. And they say statistically that human slavery is greater now than at any other time in human history. And what's the best way of having a slave? To make them think that they're free, to trick them into thinking that they're free. The land of the free. It's also said we have the best health care in the world. The exact opposite is true. 70% of Americans are taking prescription medicine, which means 70% of Americans are sick. Is there any other country in the world that has 70% of their population ill? That means whatever country they're in has the worst healthcare in the world because it's producing 2/3 of the people, almost 3/4, who are ill constantly. Imagine what it would be if we both got a phone call and our phones keep ringing. Hey, stop what you're doing. Turn on the TV and Buzz Aldrin is tearfully confessing the moon landings were fake. You know what that would be like? It would be like the whole world of those people who are deceived about this had a glass of water thrown in their face and they wake up, they're sleepwalking, and they're 1 foot away from a cliff. That's what would happen in the minds of people. They would be refreshed. You know, telling the truth about the moon landing fraud is unpleasant. And it's like, you know, cutting off a gangrened limb. But if you don't cut it off, the whole body will die. Cutting it off, you know, is a sad thing. But what choice do we have? Now, back to Gus Grissom. I interviewed Betty Grissom for 4 hours, and I interviewed his son, Scott Grissom, for 3 hours. Now, I did not put this in my film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, because she was still alive, but I was able to put it in my book, and it's the second to the last chapter in the book Moon Man, which you can get at Sabrel.com. It's called NASA's Greatest Fear. And the reason is, we know they faked the moon landing, but let's just say they faked the moon landing and they didn't kill anybody. Okay, it's a counterfeit, currency. It's a counterfeit Picasso. Whoop-de-doo, the government lies. Well, you see, it's more than that. Betty Grissom told me that the day before he burned alive, that he came home from work in Houston and said, "Hun, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad today. They've never been there before. Why are CIA agents monkeying around with all the equipment at the launch pad?" The very next day, the guy was killed by, quote, faulty equipment. I mean, that's pretty clear. He held an impromptu press conference a few days before where he hung a lemon on the top of the rocket and invited the media in. He said, "This thing is a lemon. We're 10 years away from going to the moon, not 2. So he wouldn't cooperate with the faking of the moon landing, and they burned him alive to prove a point, so that when Neil Armstrong came along, they said, "Look, you want that to happen to you as well." That's why Neil Armstrong rarely gave any interviews about it. In fact, I personally went to the archives at NASA, a vault, a literally walk-in safe. And I said, "Can you please show me one still picture of Neil Armstrong standing on the surface of the moon?" They went through the files and scratched their head and went through the files and scratched their head because there isn't one. He refused to be photographed. Now, if you and I went to Paris, how many pictures of us are there with the Eiffel Tower in the background? 24, and yet there's not a single picture of him. Now, the excuse is, well, he's taking the pictures, so he's not in them. Well, I think, if there's a 500-degree difference in temperature from light and shadow and micrometeorites and radiation, you probably have a backup camera, have a camera on both astronauts. But there's actually no photographs, still photographs of him on the moon. Basically, there were some facts that I did not put in the book because the gentleman's son was still alive, dying of cancer, and he didn't want to deal with the publicity. I didn't mention the actual name of the person, which I now mention. It's Cyrus, Cyrus Eugene Akers, Akers. That was the name of the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base, who confessed to standing beside President Johnson on June 1st, 1968, as they filmed the fake moon landing at his Air Force Base. He said they spent weeks building the set and bringing in pulverized concrete to simulate the powdery surface of the moon. There was something else he confessed to, and actually it's more significant, believe it or not. He personally murdered a coworker to keep it a secret. So there's somebody out there who was an employee, probably in the military, at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 or 1969. We don't know exactly when the murder took place, but it was more than likely 1968 or 1969. So if your followers can maybe investigate a little bit, maybe newspapers at the time in that city, Clovis, New Mexico is not that big of a city. There was either some military personnel at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 or 1969 that had a, quote, accidental death, or they simply went missing. This is the person that Cyrus Eugene Akers personally killed. To Cyrus Eugene Akers, the more grievous sin wasn't that he helped, the faking of the moon landing. The most grievous sin is that he personally killed another person. And he explained that the reason was to keep the moon landing fraud a secret, which was filmed at his base. So actually, the most important thing to Cyrus on his deathbed was confessing that he murdered somebody. And yeah, he was terminally ill. He was literally dying. And in court, a deathbed testimony has incredible weight. And he confessed to murdering another human being in the hopes of that confession helping him get right with God. And maybe that is part of it. And he added that the reason is that this coworker also eyewitnessed the faking of the moon landing at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 in Clovis, New Mexico. And they thought it was morally wrong. And they were going to go to a reporter and tell the world that our government did this horrible thing. And he either did it of his own initiative or he was ordered to do it. But he murdered that person. And that was what he confessed that I did not put in the book in addition to his name. So if maybe one of your followers out there could do a little sleuthing, see which person had an accidental death at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 or 69, if there's a record of it, or which person went missing during that time. You can go to Sabrel.com, get a copy of the book, and get a lot more information that may help this riddle be solved. I'm actually doing, God willing, a feature film this year, my first feature film. And the person is ex-military in the leading actor. And I thought, well, what job could he have? Well, I gave him the job of being a military executioner based on this information. That's where I got the idea from for a character in my first feature film. Someone who lives their life with great remorse that they had to kill a whistleblower or the likes thereof as part of their duty in the military. And that's a sad thing. He also said, his son did, that when his father was watching the moon landing, quote, live on TV and saw it as the exact thing that he had witnessed a year earlier, he wept and wept that America had stooped so low to doing such a thing. And oddly enough, still justified it. He said, well, they must have had a good reason, for faking it. Well, no, I don't think so. There's no good reason to murder people to cover up a forgery. There's no good reason to embezzle $200 billion from the taxpayers. There's no good reason to kill Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. You see, the people who run our country are not only liars, they are murderers. They murder their own people. In fact, Robert McNamara said on his deathbed that the whole reason why the Vietnam War started, the weapons of mass destruction event, the Gulf of Tonkin incident it's called, when allegedly a North Vietnamese ship attacked a U.S. ship, the miniature Pearl Harbor, which enraged the public who were previously against the Vietnam War. Suddenly they were for it if they're going to attack our guys. Robert McNamara said the CIA and they just made that up. Never happened. Now that led to the death of 3 million people, including, I think, 58,220 Americans. 58,220 Americans were murdered by liars in the CIA. They murdered the crew of Apollo 1, and they murdered a coworker whistleblower, and maybe they murdered Kubrick. And I also published in my book that when Bill Casey first appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show and said, we didn't go to the moon, I was there, and I know that fact, he was later contacted by one of the Apollo astronauts. And that person told him that he had become a born-again Christian and wanted to confess something important. On the day of that confession was to take place, that astronaut had a fatal heart attack. And so we know of multiple homicides that have taken place to keep this a secret. One of the things I point out in my book, Moon Man, at Sabrel.com, is thou dost protest too much. If the moon landings are real, then anyone who says otherwise is an idiot. So why is there, all these warnings on my videos, from YouTube? Don't believe Bart, the moon landings are real. Why are there hundreds of videos on the internet to defend the moon landings, if they're so real? Imagine if I went around saying Mickey Mouse was the first president, not George Washington. Would there be hundreds of videos to defend the fact that George Washington? No. The fact is, when something is made of straw, it has to be supported continually. In fact, if you type in moon landing fraud, you don't get anything about the fraud. You get about how the fraud is wrong. They really went to the moon. I mean, it's interesting. They always say Mr. Sobral believes the false claim that the moon missions were fake. Well, why do they have to add the word false? That's what claim means. Claim means it could be true, could not be true, but they have to, tell people, spoon feed people. And it's really sad because right now, 25% of the American public doubt the authenticity of the moon landings. In other countries, it's much greater than that because they weren't as, brainwashed as we are over here. The fact is, people wanted to believe it. The Vietnam War was going on. Tricky Dick Nixon said the greatest threat to the country at the time was people protesting the federal government, and they gave him a pep rally, something to cheer about. I also mentioned in my book the code name for the fake moon landing. Apparently, President Johnson came up with it himself. It's called code name Slam Dunk. Slam Dunk means, at least at the time, he meant it as a guarantee. It's a slam dunk, it'll be easy. And so by faking the moon landing, they could 100% guarantee the mission's success, right? Therefore, it was a slam dunk. And this is the reason why Johnson did not run for re-election, because the faking of the moon landing would be in the next term. And who knew that would work? What if you got caught faking the moon landing, being from Texas, where most of NASA is, and he didn't want to deal with that. So the idea that it's Republicans against Democrats is not true, because the Democratic President Johnson, supervised the faking of the moon landing, and Republican Richard Nixon gave it the thumbs up and had the audacity to say it was the greatest event since creation when he knew they were never on the moon. Bill Casey, he was an employee with very high security clearance who worked at Rocketdyne. I talk about this in my book. William Casey, believe it or not, his degree and why he was hired by NASA and why he had high security clearance is because he was an English major. And the Pentagon would send, memos to von Braun, and von Braun would send memos back. And German was his native language, not English, and the people at the Pentagon, the generals, were educated in war, not grammar. So he would polish up their grammar so that they would look a little bit more educated than they really were. And in order to do that, he had to have very high security clearance to read what they were saying to one another. He got a memo from von Braun that told the Pentagon, look, guys, the odds of us going to the moon on the first attempt with 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone is 1 in 10,000 chance, meaning it's a virtual guarantee we're going to kill the crew on live TV if we try to do this. And the United States wasn't about to kill, the crew going to the moon live on television. So they decided to fake it to guarantee the success, a great propaganda tool. And that's what they chose to do. Plus, as you mentioned, they were embezzling all of this money. They only went into Earth orbit, and the classified tape that I found, which you can watch for free at Sobral.com, shows that they're still in Earth orbit 3 days into the flight. Earth is big out the window.
Yeah.
In these unedited clips. So they had already done Earth orbit before, so they probably used maybe 25% of the equivalent $200 billion to fake the moon landing, but they had 3/4 of it, $150 billion in today's dollars, to do with whatever they wanted to, And what did they do with that money? CNN, by the way, was sold for, I think, just $7.5 billion, which is 1/2 the price of one aircraft carrier. So the coincidence that CNN and the CIA have the exact same ideology, not a coincidence at all. In fact, I know of at least 2 people at CNN who are literal employees of the CIA. And Woodward and Bernstein published in 1974 that they found a CIA document that showed 400 journalists on the CIA payroll to tell what they want to be told. Well, the CIA lies. That's what spies do. They lie. Everything is a lie. So most of what you see on the news, unfortunately, is not the truth. They're trying to mislead the public and basically to cover up their crimes. They have to lie to cover up their crimes, right? If you tell the truth about your crimes, you'll get caught. So they're committing all of these crimes at the taxpayer's expense, because here's the thing. We know for a fact that the CIA murdered Virgil Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee on January 27th, 1967, and that the CIA did it. This is the testimony of the dead man's wife and his son. So those salaries were paid by us, right, or our parents. And the hardware they used to rig a fake fire in a spacecraft and reverse the door to make it more difficult to get out, we paid for that too. So not only are they taking our money and deceiving us, they're using our own money to murder our brothers and sisters who are trying to expose their crimes.
Right.
And that's why I quoted Orwell last time. Whoever controls the past controls the future. So as long as they're saying the moon landings in the past are real when they're not, those same corrupt entities are controlling our destiny now and in the future. That's why without the moon landing fraud coming out, our government will remain corrupt. So it has to be exposed. There has to be house cleaning. One of the things I talk about in the book, Moon Man at Sabrell.com, is I showed this classified footage to two different news directors at NBC. They both agreed it absolutely proves that the astronauts never left Earth orbit. And one of them said he will not broadcast it because he didn't want to go down in history as the man who caused the next American Civil War. Yeah, and the other one basically told me that they got a call from the federal government threatening them not to broadcast this footage that I uncovered. And because of that, their exclusive broadcast of this footage from NBC News, national news, was canceled because the federal government told them to cancel broadcasting this footage I uncovered, which proved the moon landing fraud. All of this is in my book at Sabrell.com. When I first popped in the tape of classified footage and it said on the header of it, "Do not show to the public," and I realized it was them faking being halfway to the moon from Earth orbit, I quietly wept. I thought, is this our world? Is this the world that I live in? That their greatest accomplishment is a complete forgery? How sad is that? It's pathetic.
Yeah.
And to be part of a federal government that does that, both, from the blue side and the red side. They killed their own blue president in 1963. So don't think, one side is better or worse than the other, because that's not true. They want us going after each other, so we won't go after them. Well, just go to Sabrell.com, S as in Sam, I-B as in boy, R-E-L, Sabrell.com, and you can get it on audio. I read it myself, and Kindle and print. The book is interactive. There are 16 video clips, including the son's deathbed confession of his father's deathbed confession. And you can get all that at Sabrell.com. And I wish the moon missions were real, but they're not. And it's important truth historically for us to know. And if we want to have an honest government ever, the truth has to come out. And it's all in my book, Moon Man, the true story of a filmmaker on the CIA hit list, because I discovered audio of an astronaut's son discussing with him having me assassinated by the CIA. We actually have a recording of that on tape, which would not be necessary if they really went to the moon.
You want to call the CIA? Have them whacked?